Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the classes of dewormers and how to effectively use those in your operations.
So last week we started our base discussion on deworming and parasite control in these cattle. Today we're going to go deeper into that and talk about some of those different parasitides. We talked about application. Today we're going to break down and talk about what do those choices really mean when you select the individual products. So to starting with, we're going to go through each one of the individual parasitides that are out there. Prohibit is a really common thing that some people have used. It's important to understand that when you're in that group, you're going to get fair control of our active roundworms, but that's going to be about it. It doesn't really control some of the other things that we're looking for. Your synanthic is in the oxyphenzazole group. We're going to get good control of those active roundworms. We're going to get some control of our tapeworms, and that's going to be most of its goal. Your fenbendazoles, which is your safeguard family. This is going to get good control of our active roundworms and some control of our tapeworms. Your albendazoles get good control of our roundworms, some control of our liver flukes, which is one of the ones that's harder to find something to control them, and some control of our tapeworms as well. Your ivermectins are some of the ones that folks seem to be more familiar with. Dectomax and ivermectin both would fall in this group. They get good control of our roundworms, good control of things like mites and lice, and excellent control of warbles, and have a pretty good persistence in our cattle. Cydectin's another one, the moxidectin family, that has good control of roundworms, good control of mites and lice, excellent control of warbles, and good persistence as well. The chlorosilin is one of the ones that's sometimes harder to find. Your two main products here are your Noromectin Plus and Ivomec Plus. It's going to get good control of the liver flukes, which is one of the things that we look for in trying to control. And note that this isn't one that you find on its own. The chlorosilin is with the ivermectin in that Noromectin Plus, and so it's kind of a combination. So when we go through those classes, once you've got an idea of what kind of parasites you need to control, then we've got to look at which option for administering those is best for you. Last week, when we talked about administering injectables versus drenches versus pour-ons, we talked about some of the things that your facility needs to have in order to be able to put those out effectively. And so we're going to go through some more of those options. Some people really like a block option. There is a safeguard cattle block. This is in the fenbendazole group, and it's not to be used on dairy cattle, and it has an 11-day slaughter withdrawal for our beef cattle. The one thing with the wormers that are in a block form, you have to make sure that your cattle are getting accurately dosed, because it's not easy to keep an eye on. Is every cow getting access to that block? Are they getting as much as they need? So be sure if you're doing this method that you've got a way to track that and keep an eye that your cattle are doing what they need to do to get that effective control. We talked about drenches. This is one of the things that you really do kind of need a head gate if you're going to be effective at doing it quite a bit. You've got lots of options for drenches. This is what we call the white wormer family. You can choose between several of the different active ingredients. Some of those trade names are things like Prohibit, Synanthic, Panacure, Safeguard, and Valbazin. When you're choosing that, we also want to consider a rotation schedule. We don't want to always worm with the exact same thing. And so that's where we can rotate between these active ingredient families. We all understand that accidents do happen on the farm. You may have some freak accident, like somebody break a leg. And so having an idea of what product you used and when that withdrawal time was could open up some options for you. It's also important to note that if you're going to use Valbazin, that also has a warning that we don't want to use that within 45 days of the start of a pregnancy, or if you pull bulls, not within 45 days of that window, just to help protect those cows and protect those future calves. There's also some feed additive options. Those are things like Safeguard and Metel, depending on which active ingredient and which product you can find. Again, this is one of those things we want to make sure that we're getting accurately dosed. We want to make sure that it's getting fed to cattle that we can keep an eye on to make sure they're getting to eat it, and that enough cattle are getting their share, and you're not getting one cow that's getting the full dose for everybody. Like we said last week when we talked about administering dewormers, Injectable is probably going to be the option that we recommend the most here through the office, because it's the option that we can almost guarantee that we know that cattle got that amount of dose where it's supposed to go. You don't have to worry about, did one cow eat everybody else's share along the way? Did they lick the block enough? If it's pour on, there are some other things there we talked about a little bit last week. But with injectable, we know that that calf got that accurate dose. There are plenty of options depending on which one you want to use, what you have access to, what you used last time, so we can have that rotation going through our system, and what parasites we're trying to control. We still have those beef and slaughter warnings depending on which product. Those do change a little bit. So make sure you take time to pick the product that's right for you and right for your farm's rotation. There are a couple paste options out there. Safeguard's the most common paste, and this is one of those things to make sure that you've got a way to administer it. I highly recommend a head gate if you're trying to use an oral paste in cattle. Pour on is another really commonly used application. We talked about these a little bit last week too, if you want to go back to last week's video and see how to apply it. There's several options out there through the different ingredient families, just like our injectables and our drenches have. And there's also some interesting things here, like the ivermectin has a 0-day slaughter warning, just like the sidectin does. Again, those freak accidents happen, so sometimes that's important to note there, that you have access to those things. It's also important to note, if you're using any of the other products, what that slaughter date is, especially if you're working on calves that might be going to slaughter, that you're not using that product too close to that window. Safeguard also has a mineral option that's out there that you can use. It has a 13-day withdrawal period. Just like with the other feed throughs, just make sure those cattle are getting the accurate dose and they have access to it, and you're going through it in the time that they recommend. Another thing that most people don't realize is wormers are one of those things that the generic might not be quite as effective as a name brand. There's lots of things out there, like in our herbicide chemicals, that as long as the active ingredient percentage is the same, we can get by with generics. According to a study done here at U of A in 2003, there was a significant difference in ivermectins between brand names and generics. So whenever I recommend wormers and wormer schedules, I always tell people to go ahead and take the time to get the name brand. That way, if you're taking the time to worm, it's important we get the kind of effectiveness that we're going for. The next question is, when do I need to worm my cows? And different producers do it different ways, but depending on what you're worming, kind of tells us when we need to worm. Last week, we talked about the stages of the parasites and how to effectively control those. And so when we look at our herds, if we're talking about mature cattle, remember last week when we talked about our mature cattle, that sometimes they even start to build that natural immunity. We want to worm them near the time that they're calving. This way, when their immune system is the most compromised, they have that protection against the parasites. They can keep producing that milk and help grow our calves. Our bulls, we want to worm them in the spring and the fall. Those calves, we want to get them up around 3 to 4 months of age and give them their first round. Remember, our younger calves are the ones that are most easily affected. And so with that, we get our replacements and stalkers. Depending on what your goals are, what kind of system you have, is going to kind of dictate how often you need to worm them. We talked about dry loaded calves aren't nearly as susceptible to worms because they're not in the grass in that low grade situations where the worms tend to live. So we can get away with not doing as often for them. If you've got a stand of grass that's being frequently grazed down, you may need to be worming every 3 to 4 months. Maybe if you've got a safe pasture that you know there's not a worm problem there, you can get by with just doing it at weaning and purchase. And if you've got questions about which one of those situations is for your operation, don't hesitate to give us a call here at the office. The last group is our yearlings. Our yearlings, we're going to keep them on the same schedule as our bulls, about spring and fall until the time they mature, and then we'll back off to closer to just at calving. This has been just a quick overview of some of our dewormers. If you've got more questions, we've got a great fact sheet on our website. And I also encourage you to give us a call at the office. If you're trying to decide what's the best choice for your operation, just reach out and give us a call.
Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. We'll see you next Friday.